We've been journeying through the book of Mark together as a church, and that has taken a great deal of time. We're officially on chapter 3, which I'm really proud of, but here we are in April, and that is how far we've made it. So I think there's like 17 chapters in it or something like that, so we got a ways to go. But today, follow me along right where we are. This is Mark chapter 3, verses 7 through 10, or it might be one day. There we go. It says, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem. I'm not going to try to pronounce some of these. The regions across the Jordan and the Tyre and Sidon. Next slide there. Thanks. Because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him. For he healed many so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Is that the last verse there? That's it. Great. Okay. So there's a lot to work with there, obviously. When Corey gave me this, I was like, what are we? It's a topic about Jesus getting on a boat, and he really doesn't do much on that boat besides preach. So I searched through like every sort of commentary I could find, every nerdy little cranny I could find, and what I found was actually quite interesting. This is actually the first time in Jesus' ministry in this story as we're rolling along. And Mark is like one of my favorite books of the Bible. Speaking as a recovering alcoholic, Mark is kind of like a shot of whiskey as opposed to a light beer. It's like the absolute truth right at you. There's like very little Christmas, there's very little Easter. We're just dealing with Jesus kind of the whole way through. And where we find him in now is the first time he's really dealt with a crowd. So before this, like the crowd has been thrown out, but it's like smaller crowds. This is a crowd that is obviously so large that Jesus is now having to do some creative theater things so that he can actually be heard. So the way that they're describing this, like a crowd is defined as just an unruly group of people. That's the Webster's definition of a crowd, right? And so this is an unruly group of people. They've come from everywhere. That list of nations I couldn't pronounce, we're talking north, south, east, west. Everyone is coming from everywhere because they've heard about this teacher who speaks with authority and also heals. I mean, if you really heard about this today, if there was someone who was really providing real deal healing and all you had to do was show up, you might show up, right? So these people are coming from everywhere, and they're showing up, and this is the first time that Jesus is having to deal with this dynamic of, oh, wow, me and my 12 guys aren't as big as this huge, huge crowd. How do we manage this? So he does something really creative, and he says, put me out on a boat, because this is the type of crowd, and if you've ever been in like a scary crowd scenario, aka like leaving the Hollywood Bowl, right, you understand that like when you're leaving, there are these moments where we are like squished like sardines up against people, and we're moving, and what was happening to Jesus is this huge crowd is coming towards him, and he has absolutely no way to sort of combat that, and people are grabbing at him, and so he says, put me on a boat, like let's get some space from this crowd, and then ironically, as a sound person, I can say this, that's also like a wonderful acoustic move. He's now like able to like speak and people can hear him, but more than that, they can't crowd up on him. And what's even more interesting about this is the moment where we first see that crowd and they're in love with him. They love what he's doing right now. He's talking against the status quo, he's challenging powers, he's healing people, he's feeding people. There's a large amount of commentary just to do with the people and the crowds that showed up for Jesus simply because they were just hungry. They were actually just physically hungry. So these people start showing up from everywhere, and that can be scary at first. I remember I went to a really small school. I grew up in Amsterdam for a time, which is, you know, what the average American kid does. But I grew up in Amsterdam for a little bit, and I went to a really small international school there that spoke English. And so there were like 13 kids in my group 6 class, which is like 6th grade over there. But it was a really tiny, tight-knit community. You knew everybody from like all of the grades, and everyone was from all like regions of the world. My 2 best friends were Irish and Indonesian. It was a really kind of cool moment to just grow up in. And in Holland, like, I had a cell phone before kids had cell phones. It was like a prepaid like brick phone, but it was like it had the ability to make calls. And you could hop on trains and just go places. I rode my bike to a train station at 11 and then hopped on a train, took it, this sounds like that, I walked up the snow both ways. It's not that, it's just a fun thing. Took a train like halfway across the country because the Netherlands is tiny and you can do that in about 30 minutes. And then I got off that train and would go to school. And there was this huge amount of freedom. Like, I could go places without mom, without dad, without this whole ecosystem. And then we moved from there to Short Hills, New Jersey, which was a huge culture shift. Like, the culture shock didn't happen when we moved over to Amsterdam. It happened once we moved to New Jersey. And I was like, oh my gosh, I need mom to drive this minivan to get me anywhere now, right? It was a huge kind of shift. But the bigger thing that shifted too was that I went from this really small school where I knew everybody and I felt comfortable to an absolutely overwhelmingly large public school. There were 400 kids in Millburn Middle School in just my 8th grade class. And so I went from 13 to like 400. And I remember like at the end of the day, all the classes would get out, and the way the school was designed is there was a single door. It's almost like in this gym, like a door like that size that everybody would have to funnel through to get to the buses, right? So it's not the entire school, but there were enough of us that every time we had to do that, like I would get a little bit of anxiety going. Like, oh no, I've got to get to the bus. Will I make it to the bus? Because the other part was if you didn't get there in time, they just leave you. The bus driver would like see the crowds of kids and just go, no, not on time, we're out. And they would just leave you there. And then you'd have to like use a payphone because there were no cell phones because I'm not in Holland. Anyway, this is like just trauma coming out. Anyway, anxiety, getting to those buses, getting there. And then one day I came to school, and this was 2001. And I walked into class, and I remember looking up at the clock, and this was history class, and I was always a pretty terrible student, so being in class was something I always wanted to accelerate the process a little bit. So I would look at the clock every chance I could, just to see, like, how far into this are we? And I looked at the clock, and it was 8:14 a.m. What I didn't know, and what was happening outside of that room, was that the first plane had hit the World Trade Center, and we were in a commuter town in New Jersey about 15 minutes out of the city. I didn't know that. My friends didn't know that. No one knows that. I just have this memory of looking up and seeing that time like so distinctly. The next class that we came around to, the intercom was going nuts in the school. So every like 3 or 4 seconds, a new name would be called. This is very random, but the class that I was in was a marine biology class, which all we did was watch this show called Voyage of the Mimi, which happens to be Ben Affleck's very first sort of acting foray. And so it was interrupting the Voyage of the Mimi, and this biology teacher was not having it. She was very, very angry. So finally she just like relented, paused the tape, and we all just sat there and listened to the intercom as they were like, Johnny, come to the office. Ralph, come to the office. Like these names, just come to the office, come to the office, come to the office. And all of us are going like, what is happening? What is going on here? And again, none of us have any information, so we're just thinking like, I don't know, maybe there's something fun. All these kids are getting pulled out of school. And then we get to the next class, and we're actually told what's happened. And by this time, the class sizes have kind of dwindled, and we're down to the kids who are riding the bus. And the teacher very, very distinctly and clearly told us what was going on outside. I wish I could give this teacher a hug now. Like, I don't know where they are or what they're doing, but the way that they handled this was absolutely beautiful for a group of freaked out 8th graders. So you have to remember, each one of these kids, and for the vast majority, like their parents were working in the city. And there was no ability to just check in or send a text message or something like that to see if they were okay. We were all in limbo. And even the kids who didn't have as much to lose, like I know my dad didn't work in the city, but he was supposed to be there that day. He distinctly told me before I left, he said, I'm gonna go into the city today, I have a doctor's appointment, I'll see you after I get home. And me just thinking in that moment, oh my God, is that the last time I'll see my dad? And so this teacher beautifully was like, I'm gonna give you all a piece of paper. And she walked around very calmly and she put a piece of paper in front of us. And then she gave us a pen. And she was unhurried, unanxious, unworried. And she simply told us, I want you to write a letter to yourself. I want you to write a letter to yourself 20 years from now. And I want you to explain exactly how you're feeling in this moment. Like, what does this feel like to you? And man, because I have crazy ADHD and can't hold on to anything, I don't have this letter, and I really wish that I had this letter. But I can remember exactly what I wrote on it. I wrote that I was scared. I wrote that I didn't know where my dad was. My aunt and uncle lived in the city. I wrote that I didn't know what was going on with them or my little baby cousin who had just been born. And more than that, I started looking around the room and I started to realize that like the social dynamic that is middle school, which is the highest social order there is, was starting to evaporate before my very eyes. The bullies were crying. The popular kids were a mess, right? All of the stuff that had held together out of fear of being another 7th or 8th grader together in a room was gone. All we were now was on exactly the same page. We don't know what's going on when we leave this place. And so right after this class, they got us all out of the classrooms, and we headed towards those double doors again. It's all of us, except this time there isn't this excited clamoring to like go home and all that energy that you usually have at the end of the day. It was just quiet. And these kids were walking through this door, and we got on the bus, and even more so, man, like you remember the dynamics of a bus if you ever had to ride a bus. Where do the cool kids sit? Back of the bus, right? Cool kid, coolest kid, biggest bully, guy, a lot of trauma, a lot of alcoholism that was completely related to him. I saw him first thing I walk in. He's the first person there. His eyes are red. He's clinging the pole of the bus like I'm ready to get off this thing. And instead of an aha moment of being like, look at this guy, it literally came over me like empathy washed over me. And I was like, oh my God, him too, right? And we all get in the bus and we're all scared. And the bus driver takes off through the neighborhood that we're going to go through, and he starts dropping some of the kids off. And at first it's really quiet because we literally don't know. And this is the other thing that's like coming online for us. We don't know what's waiting for us when we go home. Like, we have no idea what we're going to walk into. Or is anybody going to be there? Is it going to be chaos? Is it going to be great? We have no idea. And so the first couple kids get off the bus, and they walk off the bus, and they go to their front door. And for the first couple of kids, the front door opens. And there's this big elation, there's this big cheer, right? And literally kids start like just softly clapping. And then finally about the fourth kid in, we get to a house and they knock on the door, no one answers, and the bus driver stays there for a little minute. And then he knocks on the door again and no one answers. And then all of us have this deep, deep feeling of, oh no. And then this kid, who's always a funny kid anyway, turns around to the whole bus, gives us a huge fist bump, and then climbs his fence to his backyard. And we're like, I guess he's going to be all right. No matter what's going on, that kid's going to be fine. And so we clapped. And then it just became every time a kid would get to their stop, we would clap. We would erupt in this uproarious applause for whatever that person was about to step into. And what happened is we were all clapping, and this is a really cool lesson to learn so early on in life, is that I realized like we're all scared. We're all walking through life like one phone call away from devastation, one phone call away from the biggest fears that we've ever imagined coming through, and we're all scared, and it's okay to admit that sometimes. But that's a new perspective to put on, and once we can actually like admit that yes, we all get afraid, we all get scared sometimes, we're all really the same. And something different happens in relationship. We're able to connect with people in a different way. Suddenly our fears don't get in the way. And all that is, it's nothing that's changed in that person or in me. It's just a change of perspective. It's just a new way of seeing something. There's this old story that a monk used to tell about a particular monk in his village. And he said that this monk would always avoid the center of the temple. And the reason was there was said to be a wolf in the center of the temple. And so he never wanted to go through the center of the temple. Had a thing about dogs, had a thing about wolves, didn't want to be there, right? And so he would go around the temple for all of his duties, carrying water, carrying grain, like extra, just because he simply didn't want to go through the center and face that wolf. And finally, one day, his duties sent him right through the center. It's unavoidable, and he has to go through. And so he takes that step, and he gets into the center of the temple. He looks the wolf dead in the eye, and when he does, he realizes the wolf is just a puppy. And the puppy comes up and licks his face, right? It's a cheesy story, but that's exactly what we do with our fear sometimes. We make a wolf out of a puppy. And all it takes is a simple change in perspective. There was a priest named Ed Dowling, Father Ed Dowling, who helped Bill Wilson write the book Alcoholics Anonymous. He also just helped Bill Wilson in his spiritual life. He was a spiritual director to Bill. And Bill writes about him like he is just this light in this life. And the thing about Ed was he wasn't an alcoholic. He was just simply helping Bill write this book and then foster this community of spiritual searchers who were looking for something, but it didn't have anything to do with the religious organization of the church. But Ed would always be there for Bill, and they would have these long talks. And once Ed just said to Bill, and I think this is one of the coolest lines that doesn't get talked about enough, he said to Bill, sometimes I think heaven is just a new pair of glasses. It's simply just putting on a new pair of glasses, like seeing things with a new perspective and not letting our expectations or us get in the way. But just seeing things for how they are, that feels like heaven. There's another story. I'm just going to be telling stories today. There's another story about two people named Reuben and Shuven. This is one of my favorite stories by a rabbi named Lawrence Kushner, if you want to look him up. He's fantastic. This story involves two people named Reuben and Shuven, and it's at the parting of the Reed Sea. There's no such thing as the Red Sea, by the way. If you look it up, it's called the Reed Sea, and we keep doing that in church. We just say Red Sea all day long. It's Reed Sea. Anyway, the parting of the Reed Sea is there, and when we think about that classic tale, right, there may be some Ten Commandments visualizations that come in. We kind of got a picture for what that's supposed to look like, but actually what that looks like is far more chaotic than it is ever portrayed. You need to think of an entire nation of people who have just upended their entire lives and brought everything they own with them to this Red Sea. That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with like a camp of thousands of people who are going to cross through this. And so when scholars actually look at this and they look at the point where they could have crossed, the average guess is that it probably took the nation of Israel around 8 to 13 hours to cross the Red Sea, right? And so the point there is there's this miracle moment, right, of this water parting. But if you're looking at like an 8 to 12, 13-hour commute through that water, you're going to begin thinking differently, right? Imagine being in the middle. Right? You got people who are the first ones, those are the brave ones. You got like the last people who are kind of waiting to see if that whole thing envelops them and will just not go. But then there's people in the middle, the messy middle, that are having to walk through this in faith, going like, I think these walls are going to hold. I think this water is going to hold up for us. And in the midst of that middle, there are two people, and their names are Reuben and Shuven. And they're walking through this literal miracle of water being parted on both sides. And for Reuben and Shuven, the whole time they're just staring down at their feet. And Reuben says to Shuven, man, it's so messy in here. It's so muddy. Like, look at how muddy my sandals are right now. This never happened back in Egypt. And when we're going there, I don't know if we're getting 3 square meals. I don't know what's going to happen. At least we had that back in Egypt. And they just complained back and forth all the way through that miracle. And what Rabbi Lawrence Kushner says at the end, for Reuben and Shuven, the miracle never happened, right? They walked through the whole thing, and because they looked down the whole time, the miracle was never available to them. And that's what I literally think expectations, and then expectations that get turned into resentments do to us. They block us from seeing the miracle of everyday life. Resentment is a huge, huge thing in recovery. And when I first got into recovery, or trying to recover from alcohol and alcoholism, I didn't realize what it was. I was so good at resentments, it turned out. I had no idea I had them, and I had a lot of them. But it's this driving force in our life, and it's something that we actually have a measure of control over if we really look at it. The biggest resentment I can think of, and this is going to be a funny one, is when I had 6 months of sobriety, for like the 9th time, I moved out of a sober living. So I was living in a sober living in Mar Vista, and it was a beautiful experience. It's where I met guys that literally changed my life. The owner of that institution, his name's Robbie. He's still one of my best friends and my mentor. And I felt so safe in this place. Like, I knew that I needed to get back to life, and that I needed to get a job again and reintegrate with my family and all of that. But there was a real fear holding me back because I was doing well in this space. And I didn't know what was going to happen when you change just a single ingredient in that stew. Like, is this going to work if I ever leave? And in about 6 months, Robbie finally said to me, hey, man, like, I love you, but there are people who really need this bed. There are people who are really going through it, and I'm just going to ask you straight out, like, do you think you can leave? And I was like, I've never been kicked out of a sober living like this before, but yeah, I think I'm healthy enough that I could go. And 6 months in sobriety, there's this really interesting thing called the hedonic treadmill. Has anyone ever heard of the hedonic treadmill? No? Anyone ever heard of the hedonic set point, maybe? Hedonic set point, the hedonic treadmill is this. It's the idea that like you could be super obsessed with like a toy as a child, and then you get that toy, and 2 days later it means nothing. As an adult, it's that promotion that you want. It's that one thing you have to have, and then your life will finally click and be in place. And once you have it, you like acclimate to it, and it no longer matters. It's our ability to feel joy and meaning, and there's a set point at which we can register it at. And when you put drugs and alcohol in your system, the set point is like way up here. And the truth is, for about 6 months, you can't hit this receptor. So no matter what you're throwing at it, no matter how much community, no matter how much meetings, all that kind of stuff, your joy and your meaning sensor is still way up here. And so whatever you're throwing is just falling a little bit short of that, right? And the key there is not depressing. So it's not to go like, oh my gosh, that's 6 months, so what should I even do in those 6 months? There's other things besides joy in life that give meaning and purpose, and those are the things that come online in that time. And they're vitally important, because life is not all about joy. But for this story, that was what was the key that was missing. And I had 6 months. That means that set point at about 6 months begins to fall. And the beautiful thing is it falls for everybody. And all you have to do is wait. There's nothing else you need to do. You remove yourself from the substance, and you wait for that hedonic set point to fall. Before you know it, you're back at a normal pace. My daughter is the perfect example of the best hedonic set point in the whole world. I can wave my hand in front of her face, and she lights up in laughter. She's 16 months old, by the way. That'd be totally different if she's like 17. she's 16 months, and that lights her up, right? That's her set point. It's so ridiculously low. What I'd like to argue is that set point is really our expectations. Her expectation for joy is not high. And that's a beautiful thing to absolutely be celebrated. So my set point was not that. It was way up here. And we were going to move. My wife we had our place in Santa Monica, which we lived in for about 10 years. And that was no longer going to serve us. I knew that if I went back to that place, I'd be drinking again. That space for me just had so many bad memories. I knew every liquor store, I knew every bar, I knew every alley. Everything had a story, right? And so we were like, let's get some distance from that part of town, and let's move somewhere new. I have always been the biggest enemy of the valley. The biggest enemy. I moved to LA in 2010, and from there I got the message that if you live in the valley, that's not such a hot thing, and I took that to heart, and I really ingrained it deep within my soul. And I tried everything I possibly could to never, ever, ever end up in the valley. I'm sorry, this is gonna end in a good place. If you live in the valley, I'm getting there. But I tried everything I could not to be in the valley. It was the heat, it's unbearable, it's unlivable at some point. 115 in Woodland Hills, that's Vegas. Anyway, thank you. Johnny, even without a mic. I tried everything I could not to be in that space, but the only place that we could move at that point, we were actually thinking of moving somewhere else in Santa Monica, and I was like, no, let's get even a little more distance. And then we just found, we were like, well, let's go live with my in-laws, my wife's parents, for a little bit, because we had racked up a lot of debt in this scenario. Going to treatment is not a cheap thing, and quitting your job is also not a cheap thing, it turns out. So we're like, let's just heal a little bit in a space. And right before we moved in, my father-in-law called me, and he was like, hey, I've got this duplex in Woodland Hills, and it's almost never open. And randomly, someone has moved out. Do you all want to move into this duplex? And there are two things going through my head. One, my father-in-law kicked a tenant out of his duplex because he doesn't want to live with me. Two, I don't want to live in Woodland Hills. Both of those things did not matter at that time because that was a wide open opportunity, and I'm not one to say no to that. That was a gift, and you don't say no to a gift. So I went, okay, yeah, let's do this. And when we landed, guys, my snobbery was through the roof. Any complaint I had somehow always centered on, oh, it's because we live in Woodland Hills. It could be anything, like the garbage isn't out. Well, it's because we live in Woodland Hills. It didn't matter, right? It was all centered on where we lived. I was so mad about that. And the truth is, I was mad about that because I had no measure of control or choice in the matter. God just picked me up and plopped me somewhere, right? And for my entire 4 years of existence until this point, I was in treatment centers, rehabs, detoxes, and your whole life is dictated down to a system of bells. A bell goes off, you're at the next session. A bell goes off, that means you're at dinner. And that was my regimented life. And coming out of that, I was like, I don't want to be in this regimented life anymore. I don't want to be somewhere I don't want to choose. And so I let my bitterness just take over. It took over everything. And I stopped doing the work, and that's the big, big piece here. I was hitting 5 meetings a week. I was working with a sponsor. I was working with other guys. I was doing really, really well in my recovery. And as soon as I moved out to Woodland Hills, I stopped going to meetings. I stopped working with those guys. I It just stopped slowly. It wasn't this big abrupt change I did, but I fell out of sync with my community that had caused so much healing in my life. And the thing about alcoholism is it's energy, and you can't destroy energy. There's no way to do that. You can't just get rid of this huge piece of energy that you were giving to something in your life. It has to get transferred to somewhere. It has to find a home. St. Augustine says this, your soul will never find rest until it rests in me, right? You have to find a space in your soul that can rest somewhere else. And I had none of that. And so I was whittling my life down to this very isolated existence where I wasn't drinking, I was sober, but I was so mad. I was angry at everything, and it was seeping into all aspects of my life. I was working a job at a medical company called Push Health, and like people in those spaces aren't necessarily nice anyway, but I was getting feedback that I was sounding mean on emails. And if you know me, that's insane. That's not a part of my demeanor, but it was coming off mean. And so I knew I needed to shift something because I knew that if that's at that breaking point, then I am just really, really close to a drink. And so I went desperately to my wife, and I thought, you know what'll fix all of this? It's not me doing more work. It's not me getting back into AA. It's not me doing all that. We need to move to Culver City. So we looked. We couldn't afford this. We couldn't do any of that. We were healing right now. This was a healing moment, and I was like a big middle finger to God, like, you're healing? I won't take that. I'm going to go do my own thing. And so we found a place in Culver City, right on the edge of Culver and West Adams, right near the Biana Creek. Lovely. Beautiful. I can ride my bike everywhere. This is a new thing. There's also like lots of meetings around. This is going to be awesome. The first week we're there, we move in, and I wake up, and this is fine for me. I've been in sober livings and detoxes for a long time now, but I wake up to a man whose face is covered in tattoos looking through our window into our bed. And I went, well, that's out of place. And I walked outside, saw what was going on, and the guy was like, do you have any money? And I went, no. And then he went, okay, see you later. And he dropped his pants. This is a true story. Dropped his pants and then ran out and then ran to the left. That was the first deal that we dealt with. And then after that, our car was broken into 5 times on this street. Not awesome. And so it just became a painful place, to be honest. It was a painful place to be, and I realized we had a baby during this time, which is a real uncomfortable thing to do in general. There's a lot that you have to catch up to. And we weren't adequately prepared in this space for that. My poor mother-in-law was driving like an hour and a half in traffic to get to us in Culver, and the only reason she was having to do that is because this alcoholic didn't want to go to meetings and just wanted to be in Culver City. And so finally, one day we're driving back through the area that we used to live in, Woodland Hills, and it's right after all these storms have hit in the beginning of this year, and it's totally green, and it's absolutely beautiful. And as we passed the exit that we used to live at, something came over me. Something I hadn't felt in a really long time. It felt like this big warm gust of air that just like infused in my chest. And I looked around and I had the thought, and I thought, ooh, don't say this out loud. And then I said it out loud, which was, why don't we live in Woodland Hills? And my wife knowingly said, we've arrived. We've come back. And I think that big warm gust of air that I felt in my chest that felt so familiar was, and this is going to sound cheesy, and I hate language like this, but I'm going to use it, that was the voice of God for me. That was this voice that I was familiar with from a different point in my life that I had stopped listening to. And so this thing that was both familiar and new came up in me, and it felt like confirmation. It felt like something good. And I got to tell you, after about 5 years of running and white-knuckling it, to feel something generative and to feel God say, hey, this is a good way, felt like there was nothing that could stop me from joining in that sort of energy and in that movement. And so we moved back, this is hilarious. I had a therapist, because I started doing the work again. I had a therapist who said, you need to be going to the meetings that you were going to. Jump back into that community, and I did. And that was a really, really beautiful thing. I still had time. I still had this connection with people. And I was able to jump right back into that. But not only that, he said, you have lost, just like that voice, because I had told him about that warm gust. He said, you've lost a lot of the things that connected you to God in the first place, that connected you to the source. You don't play music anymore. You don't really hang out with friends. I want you to do the things that you used to do as a child that brought you joy, and do those as an adult. And so I went into the garage and I got my guitar out, and I have a commitment to myself where I play guitar as much as I possibly can. Not for any professional thing, but just so that I can play it. And now my daughter loves it, and so when I play guitar, I get to just do little concerts for Gracie, and it's the greatest part of my day. He also said you need to do the things that lit you up back then. A big thing for me was pizza back in the day. I don't know if you were a kid and pizza was a big thing for you, but pizza was a huge thing for me. So I went on Craigslist and I bought a used pizza oven. It is very dangerous at this point. It's been sitting outside in the rain, so I don't know if it works anymore. And I started making pizza, and then the funniest thing started happening. I started going to the stores that were around us, because for so long in the valley living there, I was so anti, no. I was working in Culver City and Santa Monica, so I would do my shopping over there. That's how deep and weird this got. And so I started actually living my life in the place that we led. And I found out there's this place called Tomato Pie Pizza Joint. Anybody heard of Tomato Pie? There's one in Silver. Yeah, that's not even a block from my house. It's right there. It's the 7th best pizza in the nation. GQ rated it. So whenever I eat it now, I'm always like, this is the 7th best pizza in the nation. There's that pizza place. There's a guitar store right next to that pizza place. There's a barbecue place across the street. There's a spiritual healing center that's a catty corner away, which I could probably buy weed at if I wanted to. But it's a space in which you can go for healing. Everything that my little heart desired when I was a kid is 1 block away from me. And all it took was a new pair of glasses to be able to actually see that and engage with that. And going back to that original crowd, that crowd eventually turns on Jesus because Jesus is not what they ultimately want. Their expectations are for something completely different. And yet when Jesus shows up, in reality, he's a different type of good news. And I'm in a space in my life now where I love a different type of good news. A type of good news I can't write for myself, that I can't make up for myself, but good news that comes from a true source that's truly original. And I'm so glad that Jesus isn't who that crowd wanted him to be. And I'm also so glad that Woodland Hills wasn't what I wanted it to be. I'm so glad when our expectations get broken and we get to see something for how it truly, truly is, because that's when healing happens. So with that, you're going to get back in your groups, and we're going to go through this question together. Where do you need to adjust your expectation?